series that has been given at the Metropolitan Museum of Art since 1987, covering topics related to Egypt, ancient Near Eastern and Islamic art, Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern, art and archaeology. These lectures have enlightened us on fields in which Charles Wilkinson distinguished himself. The lecture series has been supported over the years by many friends of Charles Wilkinson from all across the world. Now, by this year, these supporters have started to include people who never knew Charles Wilkinson, as the lectures themselves have become a kind of institution within this institution. And so their support has extended to people who know Wilkinson through his publications and his other work that he did here and abroad, and also later on at the Brooklyn Museum. And we're very gratified that this support has continued long after Charles Wilkinson himself has been gone. Now, at the inaugural lecture series in 1987, Philippe de Montebello said, I think Charles Wilkinson, more than many, was a particularly precious asset, a man who worked extensively in the countries of his interest, who was a connoisseur and a scholar. Associated with this institution for 66 years, Wilkinson worked under 6 of the 8 directors at that point, in 1987, of the museum. From 1920, when he joined the graphic section of the Metropolitan Museum's Egyptian expedition, to 1963, when he became curator emeritus at the Met, he excavated at Qasr Abu Nasr and Nishapur, that was in the 1930s and 40s, at Nimrud in the 1950s and 60s, among other sites. He served as curator of ancient Near Eastern art, and later, when that department merged with Islamic art in 1959, he became head of the joint departments. His many publications on the places where he worked continue to enlighten us, and I know from experience of having reinstalled our new galleries of the arts of the Arab lands, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and later South Asia, that without his publications on Nishapur, we certainly would have been lost. So now I'm going to turn to introducing my colleague Joan Aruz, curator in charge of the Department of Ancient Near East, and she will introduce our first speaker in our lecture series today, Games of the Ancient World.
Hello, it's with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker, Dr. Irving Finkel. When we determined that this year's Wilkinson lectures would focus on games in antiquity, we knew there could be no better person than Irving Finkel, an expert on board games and a world-renowned authority on the Sumerian royal game of Ur, to introduce the theme today and to share his innovative thoughts on the subject. Irving Finkel is internationally recognized as one of our most accomplished Assyriologists, having earned his BA degree in Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the University of Birmingham in 1972. He went on to complete his doctorate there in 1976 with a thesis on ancient Mesopotamian exorcistic incantations. Following his PhD, Dr. Finkel came to the U.S. and spent 3 years as a research associate at the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, where he worked on both materials for the Sumerian Dictionary Project and the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. Then, in 1979, he returned to the UK and began working in the British Museum in the Department of Western Asiatic Antiquities, now known as the Department of the Middle East. Irving Finkel is presently assistant keeper, responsible for the British Museum's outstanding cuneiform collections, and can be credited with enormous contributions to the study of this resource. With too many articles to count, and I did try but gave up, it is hard to choose which to mention, but I would just like to draw your attention to the way Irving combines expertise and a poetic command of English in his beautiful and moving translation of the lament of Nabu-shuma-uken, the imprisoned son of Nebuchadnezzar who later ruled as Amel-Marduk, the biblical evil Merodach, as well as his translation of the famous Cyrus cylinder, which you can find on the British Museum website. I also mention a book edited with Mark Geller on Sumerian guards and representations, and more recently, a work edited with Andrew George and dedicated to his teacher, Wilfred G. Lambert, with the title Wisdom, Gods, and Literature. One of Irving Finkel's main interests remains Babylonian magic and medicine, and indeed, he presented a paper at the Met on Babylonian medicine during the Wilkinson lectures that we held around 7 years ago. His interests also cover ancient Mesopotamian history, literature and religion, archaeomusicology, and of course, the history of games. Irving Finkel is one of the founders of the annual Board Game Studies Conference and editor of Ancient Board Games in Perspective, published by the British Museum Press in 2007, a volume that contains his definitive work on the rules for the royal game of Ur. He is also the author of popular books, including Ancient Board Games and the British Museum publication Games. He has worked with the Anthropological Survey of India on a major project, the Indian Board Game Survey, capturing information on many games now close to extinction, which will soon be published under his editorship. As the British Museum expert on games, Dr. Finkel is in contact with scholars and enthusiasts around the world on games, ancient and modern, living and extinct. He curated the British Museum touring exhibition Across the Board and an extraordinarily popular British Museum exhibition on the royal game of Ur. There was also the wonderful show that he organized a few years ago at the Asia Society on Asian Games, The Art of Contest. Most recently, he was curator of the British Museum's critically acclaimed exhibition, Babylon, Myth and Reality, and also editor of its catalog. He is also, not surprisingly, an authority on the Lewis chessmen, now on loan to the cloisters from the British Museum for the exhibition, The Game of Kings. I am sure we all look forward to hearing Dr. Finkel speak today about how ancient board games were disseminated. His title sums it up, like spilt milk.
Well, it's rather a tricky proposition to follow that introduction. In the British Museum, that would count as a lecture, and people will be asking questions already. I'm going to talk to you about board games. I could talk for 2 hours, 4 hours, or for about 5 days, but I've decided that I'm going to talk to you punctually for 1 hour, but you have to pay a lot of attention because there's going to be a short test at the end. So I'm going to talk to you about a topic which most board games historians, and there are altogether about 87 of them, almost to a man ignore, which is the process by which board games spread around the world. And anyone who ever looks into this topic will shortly discover that there are very many interesting examples of games that last for an unimaginable amount of time and that find themselves appearing in different parts of the globe. And scholars who work on them tend to document these things in isolation, and the interesting question is, how can it be that all these things spread and last, and what is the background to it? So this is the courageous topic I'm going to address this afternoon. If I get lost, you'll know why. So we will start with the first slide. It's not all like this, don't panic, but I think we have to realize that we are dealing with a very academic and serious matter which has to be handled in that sort of fashion. So the question is, how do people learn games in the first place? And this is just one aspect of board game history which is just taken for granted. Nobody ever asks this question. But children and adults learn even complex games just by watching them and then trying to play themselves. This is a universal truth. The kind of family that buys a new board game and reads the rules together from the inside of the lid and then tries to follow them logically is never attested in the human race. Anybody who does that is really substantially abnormal. So what happens is that when you have a flourishing game, people watch, children watch, and they pick things up. And what happens in real experience is that the rules of a game only come into practical relevance as and when people who are trying themselves to play the thing discover a problem. So you play by imitation, you do what you've seen people do, and then sometimes you don't know what happens if I do this, can the other person do that? And one has to remember that if you're dealing with ancient games and pre-commercial games, which is what this afternoon we will all be talking about, you are dealing with something which we take for granted as being governed by official rules written in an itemized list, but which of course existed in antiquity without any rules at all. Nobody wrote down, normally, rules for a game. So it was always a traditional matter. So that when there's a problem, when you have a new game, if someone does X, can I do Y? This is not settled by reference to an encyclopedic set of rules, but just by the prevailing tradition. This applies equally fertilely in the modern world. So, for example, with Monopoly, many people play the rule that when you pay a fine, you put the money back into the money box. In other households, you put the money in the middle, and then when you land on some arbitrary Trojan square, you grab all the money and annoy all your brothers and sisters. Well, in point of fact, the world is divided into two fiercely opposed groups about this specific rule in Monopoly. And if ever you're in a circumstance when they happen to be round the table playing the game together, bloodshed is inevitable. The next rule about games, which is worth clarifying, is that, generally speaking, games are taught children by their grandparents and not by their parents. This is because parents are too busy watching television and other more absorbing things than to be bothered with teaching children how to play. But grandparents who are worried about illiteracy and innumeracy suddenly think that Scrabble or something like that might teach the little blighter some kind of understanding of the universe. And this is how dominoes, Ludo, and other things tend to find a specific healthy role between grandparents and grandchild. It's also a good way of doing something if you can't think of anything else. Another crucial rule is that specific rules or details which apply to a game whose age and distribution are taken for granted, that's to say, people have always done it, are understood by people as to being local to a family or area. This is an unintelligible dictum. Let me explain. I discovered, for example, that the cross game of Ludo or Pachisi, which I'll talk about a bit later on, is played in Syria by an elusive class of middle-aged affluent women who are never exposed to anthropologists and therefore has hardly been documented in print. And it turns out that families who play this game among themselves use numbers that none of them can understand. And when I've asked people about them, they have always assumed that the numbers which they learnt from their parents are special family words like nicknames and other non-lexical items which everybody in the family knows and everybody uses. The fact is, however, that these numbers are the perfectly normal Persian numbers 1 to 12. And this game arrived from Persia into the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And when it came with it, it brought the numbers as part of the game. People learnt the numbers, and they thought after a while that they were just family words, but they were real words and very revealing because they exemplified the fact that this game in Syria had come from Persia. And finally, the idea that there's a right way or wrong way to play a traditional board game is independent of central, codified, or rationally summarized rules. In other words, there is nobody in the world in antiquity who can say, no, you can't do that. There are no rules. This is interesting because in the modern world, board games are defined by rules. So we have to consider, how is it that board games are disseminated and why? The first point is that games in the world are divided into two categories from another point of view: good games and bad games. A good example of a bad game is a medieval invention called arithmomachi, which was put together by a series of over-learned monks who had nothing to do in the winter evenings and invented a game with the arithmetical powers of the pieces on a huge board, which was so complicated that about 7 or 8 major treatises in Latin were written about it, and then it died completely. So this is an example of what a commercial person in the modern world, or as a subjective board game historian, would simply call a bad game. Good games, on the other hand, are very durable indeed, and they spread. So if you have a game in existence, it will go from village to village, from city to city, from continent to continent. And this explains why I have used Spilt milk as the title for this talk. Because if you've ever dropped a glass bottle of milk on a stone kitchen floor, you will be familiar with the way the milk runs under the fridge, under the cooker, and is irretrievable by any force known to man. This sort of principle governs the fate of board games, because there is a deep hunger in society for what we might glibly call a good game. It is an interesting matter for reflection that among the populations of the modern world, it is not possible to point to a clearly defined society which has no board game at all. Archaeologically, board games are already in existence by about 8000 BC in the Middle East. So these two pieces of data certainly encourage us to consider that the playing of board games is a kind of natural human activity. And I think this is a legitimate claim, and that the position of board games under that umbrella is expressed by the simple word pastime, and that basically speaking, games owe their inception to the need for something to fill in time when there was any kind of leisure, and that has always been their basic position in the world. So we will claim that good games cannot be stopped, and this is easy to demonstrate. Fidel Castro ordered the burning of every monopoly set within his kingdom. This was unsuccessful. The Taliban used to hang people who were caught playing chess, but even Chairman Mao could not stop people from playing mahjong. There is something incredibly durable about board games, which means, firstly, as I say, they are a human characteristic, but secondly, and more significantly for the historian, you are entitled to make the conclusion that a game once started will, in fact, run under its own impetus into the future. And one would have to, I think, demonstrate that something really stopped rather than demonstrate that it really went on. If we have this rule that games have their internal strength and their durable existence, this entitles us as archaeologists or anthropologists to look at the globe in a very broad and liberal way and to take things from different parts of the world and say not that they are fortuitous, chancy discoveries, but they are connected, and that the presence of something in one continent and the presence of something in another continent must be explained by the intervening history. So, means of transmission. I've decided that really the only way to look at this is to make a list of possible terms which come under this heading. And they go as follows: friends, family, and tribe. So this sort of primitive anthropological thinking by me is a helpful starting point, because this is what you might call the most natural environment for a game to be developed, to be refined, for all the inadequacies and shortcomings to be ironed out, all the unfairnesses to be squashed, so that you have a sleek and streamlined board game which then takes a very firm position in society and spreads, firstly, among those connecting groups, friends, family, and tribe, whatever they mean. And then we have what you might call secondary factors that scoop up games and move them from a small local horizon to a much broader one, perhaps in some cases global. So first among these, we can consider soldiers, and especially mercenaries, who are associated in everyone's mind with gambling and dice games, who move across the world following Alexander, taking with them the games that they play at home, introducing them locally, teaching them to soldiers they meet on the road, altogether forming a kind of network of communication from person to person. And this network system, which underlies the other categories, is a very interesting thing, because it seems to me clear that the very essence of this communication is nothing to do with language, and especially nothing to do with writing. In the real world, soldiers who, having spent the afternoon trying to kill one another, in a matey way go for a drink in the evening, might easily, you could imagine, play a simple dice game or a race game one to the other with the minimum amount of language necessary. And this simple illustration of a single spot in time, in fact, runs as a general principle for such communication, that a board game is one of those things that people can teach, people can learn, people can watch, and people can spread without any writing, without any formal communication, but just by demonstration and so forth. Now, this network of communication that one can posit has, of course, its innate problems. That's to say, you're an Egyptian and you go to Babylon and you go to a pub and you see a wonderful board game and you play it for 2 days, and when you get back to Thebes, you try and draw the board on the floor to teach all your friends and relatives, and you can't quite remember how many squares there were, you can't quite remember where the X marks were, and you certainly can't remember all the rules. But, of course, you've told everybody how interesting it is, so you have to teach them, so you have to make it up. And you make up a bit here and a bit there, and soon it becomes ironed out, because what happens, the original game had high integrity, the barbarized version is inadequate, but in a fresh installation in a different world, it becomes a new organic thing with the same streamlined activity. So here, it seems to me, you can posit a phenomenal means of communication by such people as soldiers, and of course merchants, caravans, and travelling traders and sailors and so forth are very much the same kind of thing. People, for one reason or another, who leave one culture and travel to another, take in their minds or in their hands the apparatus for their own games. And to match this network, it seems to me, we have to keep in mind this resolute need for some kind of good game by people who've never had one, or whose own game is rather pathetic, like 3 in a row, and when they meet chess, everybody never plays 3 in a row again, because now at last we have an interesting board game. So you have on the one hand a kind of appetite, and on the other a magical means for dissemination, which runs in a way like cold from person to person, nose to nose. It can't be stopped, it can't even be quantified. Then we have slaves, we have, of course, refugees, and worst of all, we have missionaries. Meddlesome, muddlesome, interfering missionaries who go around the world and do damage. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of what we might call case studies, or milk bottles, to illumine this basic set of principles. So in the middle, we have here part of a game board which comes from the Indus Valley, dated to about 2600 BC. This is a recent archaeological discovery. It is, in fact, the same game as here at the bottom, this game from Iraq, which is very famous, which is the one in the British Museum. It's the same game as this version from Iran. And in the middle of the 3rd millennium, there's a spread of archaeological discovery, quite recent, some of it, which shows that this game here, which consists of a block of squares and a long neck and here is the bit at the end, like the bridge, which is missing in this brick example, is attested about the same period, the middle of the 3rd millennium, in these 3 cultures. Now, these are 3 cultures where archaeologically we can demonstrate contact, serious contact of the merchant type, possibly others as well. And this is an archetype illustration of a simple playing grid which turns up in these different cultures, accompanied by other things which have travelled. And it exemplifies an important principle, because if we are going to consider that something in one part of the world is related to something in another part of the world, we have to define which criteria demand that the 2 are put side by side, and which can be dismissed as coincidence or something which might freely have appeared in one place, freely have appeared in another. No one has ever made a list of such criteria which demand that the 2 may be connected. But this game of 20 squares is a good example, because this block of squares, a smaller block and a connecting bridge, is sufficiently idiosyncratic to say that it stands apart from your normal kind of gaming board. And so I think we can be certain, whether or not it began in the Indus Valley, but that it moved into Iran, it moved into Iraq, and so forth. At the same time, this game was played within the Indian subcontinent, as we can show from archaeology, right down to the 1st millennium AD, because there are plenty of cases, 2 in fact, of this pattern being found engraved in stone pavements in Indian sites. So we can document it, we can say that this game probably started here. It went through Iran to Iraq with its history, which we will consider in a moment, but meanwhile it stayed here in its homeland and lasted through both in India and Sri Lanka into the 1st millennium. So you have a kind of explosive matter. This is the bomb at the beginning. This is something which must have evolved out of many forerunners. It's a game for 2 players. It's a game where each has the same pieces with the same value, and it's a race round the track, and some squares are good and some squares are not so good. And the game, as we now know it from an ancient inscription, is a good, fast race game, and it's perfectly intelligible why, wherever it began, it could have lasted and lasted as it actually did, as we can see from archaeology. So, following this milk bottle, once the board game got to Iraq, here, in about 2500 BC, we can see from archaeological work that the board spread out across the Middle East in this fashion. So it ended up in Crete and Cyprus and Egypt. And for certain, this is the tail end of the expansion by these communicative means across the world, from India through Iran, Iraq, and across the Middle East. In a way, the distribution of this game of 20 squares is analogous to chess, which probably began in the same part of the world and followed a similar history. And we can see, for example, how do we know that this is true? Well, the boards from Egypt are dated to the period of the Hyksos, when Asiatics took over control in Egypt for the first time. They brought with them their Asiatic barbaric board game, which became popular and in fact displaced the Egyptian game for a while in popular terms. And then we have something even more interesting, because we have this board firmly embedded in Babylonian culture. It was there for the Sumerians in 2600, it was there in 600 BC for the Babylonians, and it was there when the Persians came and when the Seleucids ruled. It was the national game of Iraq. And what happened was that after the Cyrus business, when a certain number of Judeans or Jews went back to Palestine, many of them stayed in Babylon. Some of their descendants moved along the coastline and ended up in Cochin in southwest India. And these Babylonians who made this journey took with them from Babylon the game that everybody played on the sidewalk and in coffee bars, either in their heads or literally as a physical board. And when they got to Cochin and they built their settlements and they settled there in the 1st centuries AD and lived there until now, they took with them this game for use in their new lives. So this is a modern 1950s wooden board, which is a really difficult to see photograph, but you can perhaps see these rows of shells which organize the outer flank of this box area. And then up the middle, there is the track of 10 squares, which corresponds to this. And the Babylonian version has 20 squares altogether. This this Cochini Indian board has 20 squares in a slightly different layout. But there can be no doubt, because we have the rules for this Indian game, that this game is linearly descended from the one which was in Babylon. And this game in Babylon came to Babylon through Iran from India. And so you have this wonderful, endless spiral of games that go from place to place, where we cannot historically point to the means of transmission. We cannot say Mr. So-and-so had this in his house, or Miss So-and-so had a great favour for this particular game, or any form of convincing documentary evidence to support the claim. But you have here a continuum from 2600 BC until about 2002 AD. Then we have the wonderful game of Pachisi. And this is an ancient Indian activity. It's played, as you will know from the modern American counterpart, on a cross board. This is a classic example of a traditional Indian board. And you have rows of squares, you have dice and pieces, and it's a race around with different rules. And it's an interesting thing that this game must have its origin in India in very remote times, and is a four-handed game as opposed to the Indus Valley 20 squares board that I just showed before, which is for two players. And it is certainly true that in the games of the world, almost all are for two players. And it's a good question how this national game of India, as it's still sometimes called, is a game for four players. I imagine that there was a proto-form of it, which was a two-player race game, and then somebody had the bright idea of putting the two games together and making a much more complicated one, which then found a secure route, a secure niche in society, and displaced the putative early example. So in about 1801, a defrocked English colonel tried to earn a living in London by producing this game of Pachisi with a set of rules and to sell it in Bath, hoping to feed his many children. And this was a very unsuccessful business venture. But later on in the 19th century, this game Pachisi became a very, very successful commercial proposition. It reached America in about the same time as London, at the same time as its increase in London in about 1860. So you'll probably agree that most American households have a copy of Pachisi in the cupboard under the television. And Pachisi is a world-conquering game which has gone on forever. The game of Ludo, which is the pompously named English equivalent of Pachisi, because Ludo means I play, and it comes from a time in English history when people used to call their dogs Fido, which meant in Latin, I am faithful. So the board game, which everyone was supposed to play at Christmas, was called Ludo, meaning I play. At some time in the 1960s, this English monstrous game, which is completely fatuous, has no complexity at all, like the original, is in fact a total waste of time, moved from Europe or England back into India, where people play the English corrupt, decrepit version of this game with every appearance of enjoyment, completely oblivious to the fact that since the 16th century, their rulers and their aristocrats and then everybody else played the complicated game before. So we have this wonderful idea of a kind of circle that goes round and round and round. Then we have this other business about things lasting when we can't prove them. And Egypt is furnished an absolutely wonderful case for this, because there are quite a few examples of this game of the snake, which is carved on a limestone table with a snake into the middle, with spaces on the gaming board indicating the scale of the snake's body. And this game was very popular only in the Old Kingdom in Egypt, around 2,800 or so. And we have both the boards, we have some pieces, and we have wall paintings, including a box of all the pieces. And there were two kinds of piece, which is very unusual. There were kind of lions, and there were kinds of marbles. So this sometimes happens, that archaeology gives a board and dice and pieces. There are no dice in this case surviving. But then you have a conundrum. How on earth do you play this game? And all sorts of people, lots of them mad, have all sorts of ideas. And then a British army officer in the Egyptian Sudan in about 1920 wrote an article about this game of the hyena, which he'd seen tribesmen playing. And the pieces in the tribesman game, which, as you can see, is a coil like this to the middle, he got the rules from these Sudanese chaps, and there were two basic pieces, one a bit like a marble, and they were called the old women, and the complex pieces, rather like the lions there, were called hyenas. And you played this game with staves, which were flat on one side and curved on the other, and you throw them up in the air and you count the number of flat sides exposed. It's a kind of giddy form of excitement. And the Egyptians had these playing staves, and these Sudanese chaps used the same sort of thing with twigs. And anyway, the Sudanese rule was this, and it explained why there were two kinds of pieces. So you throw your staves up in the air, and you have to maneuver your old lady round the track all the way to the middle, where they fill up a pitcher of water, and then you have to throw the dice step by step to bring the old lady all the way back. And the first one to get the old lady there is the winner. You can see it's obviously historical fun. And what happens in the Sudan to alleviate the apparent tedium is that the hyenas are also controlled by the throwing staves, and you have 4 or 6 pieces each. So when you've got one of your grandmothers back here, you then activate your hyena, and the hyena responds with double power to the throw of the stave. So in other words, what was once 2 is now 4, and so forth. And the hyena goes lolloping round the track and gobbles up the grandmothers who are there, and the grandmothers have to try and run for their lives, and it is really quite an exciting game. Now, this was in the 1920s when this article was written, and the Egyptological view of the Old Kingdom game was that although it sometimes appears in paintings, and although in the very late period, the Saite period, you sometimes find references to this game for old-fashioned or sort of nostalgic reasons, it was never a vital thing after the Old Kingdom Egypt. Now, if you're a cynical person, you will say, well, this is just coincidence. No one can say that the gap between 2800 BC and 1920 AD can be possibly ignored. But it seems to me that it is compelling to link the one with the other. You have a spiral, which is not necessarily so diagnostically significant, but what you do have, apart from the shared throwing sticks, which I didn't illustrate, you have 2 kinds of pieces, one twice as powerful as the other. This is a mechanism which in traditional board games is very unusual. It is not easy, in fact, to find another case. So when you combine these features of the 2 together, it seems to me of the 2 possible explanations, one being that there's no connection between them, and the other being that they are definitely connected, is that this game existed below the radar ever since the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and people played it by watering holes in the desert. They used bits of camel dung, they used bits of stick, and they played this game, and they played this game largely for the crucial and archaeologically establishable reason that there was nothing else to do. So then we must think about the mechanism of transport. When those English people who felt like a holiday and decided to try America for the first time left the shores of Britain in their dodgy-looking boats, they took with them chess and draughts. I don't think that the first thing they did when they landed on the beach and lit a fire was to drag out the games box and have a match, but nevertheless, you can be sure that this is the means whereby chess and draughts first entered this country. and it illustrates in a simple way a singularly important issue, that a game in all its complexity can travel from one continent to another just in somebody's head. You don't need a library, you don't need a magnetic chessboard for teaching purposes, and you don't need a chess set at all in order to go abroad, settle a new continent, and start a chess tournament. And then, finally, I have to talk to you about the missionaries. Our chairperson, Madam, mentioned in her introduction that I'd done some work on tracking board games in India which were on the point of extinction. And the Wanchu, who live in Arunachal Pradesh, which is near Burma, in jungle and very inaccessible territory, furnished the anthropologist who went up there with evidence for 3 board games, of which one, which he called Manchael, is in front of you now. And according to this anthropologist, you get a bamboo, a flat piece of bamboo, and you make holes, as shown in this diagram, in rows, burning with a needle, so that you have this grid. And they draw a thin line between them with the needle itself. And then you take it in turns to play, and you take a piece of charcoal and you connect them. And once you have a square, it says, at the end you count the squares separately. The player who gets the maximum number of squares wins the game. And in earlier days, they marked the squares using any kind of symbols, but nowadays they generally use the first alphabetic letter of their name. In this way, the squares are filled up and the game is considered at an end. Now, if you have a rucksack and a notebook and an iPod, and you end up in a jungle near Burma, you imagine that whatever social time pass activities you encounter, whatever traditions you might meet, are likely to be unadulterated by the outside world. And this anthropologist went to a lot of trouble to record all the information he could. There's much more than I put on this slide about how this game worked and what fun it was. And he thought this was a very interesting thing for these people to have thought up. Well, of course, what really happened was that a missionary who was living among the Wanchus decided that all the small children under their care had to be taught to read and write. I don't know why they thought this, but that's what they thought. So they had a brilliant idea that the thing they used to do with their own aunt at Christmas, with a piece of pencil and a piece of paper, and you draw a grid and you put a box and you put L for Lucy in yours and M for Maggie in hers, would be a simple way of absorbing the attention of these young persons while teaching them the letters of the English alphabet. And so that's obviously what happened. And after a while, when the missionaries had gone home or been eaten, they then played the game with not pencil and paper any longer, but with a local version, which is what they always use for board games. That's to say, a sheet of bamboo with holes with a hot poker. And after a while, I suppose, they forgot the reading, they forgot the writing, and they just made a mark. And then, obviously, under pressure from this anthropologist, they suddenly remembered that the marks that they really liked to make, which were unintelligible to anybody, were actually just boring old letters after all. So when you see this, you can imagine at the end of a 3-month trek with your notebook ready, and you see people in a clearing playing eagerly a board game of this type, you think, gosh, this is really sophisticated, it's abstract, it's this, it's that, but all it really is a derivative of interference. And then finally, I have to show you this. This part of the same project of investigation went to the Nicobar Islands, and on the North Sentinel Island, they were shown this gaming board, which is made of a very soft wood, and shell pieces and stone pieces are pressed, as you can see, into the surface to make 8x8 squares. Well, absolutely, the anthropologist wrote pages of exuberant prose because he thought that he'd discovered the origin of chess. Because on North Sentinel Island, it was a tricky matter to land. They didn't like people who did, and many of them never survived the process. So they were, on the whole, left alone. So he thought that this object floating in the water as they landed themselves showed that chess was invented by these small Nicobar Island locals. Well, this was published in a journal, so we thought we would send a new anthropologist to go and see if we could find out a bit more. And what we discovered was that this actually is a game of checkers, or drafts as it's called in English, and these chaps played a really bizarre form of checkers, which could only be understood in the following way: that perhaps 100 years before, an earnest Englishman had made this board and made all the pieces and said, this is what you do, and explained how you move diagonally and you jump over pieces, and they probably played it merrily and merrily and merrily for a long time. And then the missionary left and went home or was eaten, and they still had the stuff. And after a while, they couldn't quite remember this detail, and they couldn't quite remember that detail. So what they did was they made up more complicated details in the kind of way that the missionary would probably have liked in order to keep the game going. And 100 years later, it was as far removed from drafts as you could imagine, unless you looked at it through a microscope back to front, when you could see that the underlying game was the game of checkers. So this, again, is the result of missionary teaching and interfering with what I like to think of the natural evolution of games in parts of the world that they never reach. And this, to conclude, is an example of spilt milk which you should not lap up without thinking carefully. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adela Oppenheim, and I'm an associate curator in the Egyptian department. And it is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Anne Elizabeth Dunn-Vaturi, who is a Hagop Kevorkian research associate in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art of the Metropolitan Museum. And she is currently working in that department, documenting the provenance of the ancient Near East collection. However, she is also involved with Egyptian material, and she is now working on curating an exhibition, The Art of Games, Games and Art, which will appear next fall in the Cluny Museum in Paris, and will be seen there from November of this year until March 2013. And actually, our department, the Egyptian department, along with some other departments in the museum, will be sending objects to this exhibition. She has studied in the École du Louvre, and she's written about olive oil production in the Levant before the Hellenistic period, fortunately translated, so I don't have to try to pronounce it in French, for her MA thesis at the Sorbonne University. And she became involved with board games while working for the Département des Antiquités Orientales at the Louvre, and where she also wrote essays about their game collection. Her main interest is the game of Hounds and Jackals, which is the topic of her lecture today. And you see it actually here. This is probably one of the most famous, or maybe the most famous game that has come down to us from ancient Egypt. And she's also written about other games that were played in the Near East. So it was with great pleasure that I introduce Anne Elizabeth Dunn-Vaturi, who will now speak about Between Play and Rebirth, the game of Hounds and Jackals.
I would like to thank Dorothea Arnold for her invitation to speak here today, as well as her help and comments during the preparation. I'm also very grateful to John Arrouz and the entire Ancient Near Eastern department staff for their kind support the past weeks, I should say even month. As you now know from Irving Finkel's presentation with the game of the snake, Egyptians have enjoyed board games since pre-dynastic times. The Senet is the most famous game known to us and played by the ancient Egyptians throughout their history, all the way to the Roman period. It is played on a 3x10 grid of squares. Here on the right, are the impressive games from Tutankhamun tomb in the Cairo Museum. At the back, the great ivory and ebony box on a sledge-type stand, and in the front, 3 other sets which show you the different sizes in which a game could be manufactured. It is often depicted in tomb paintings and reliefs, as well as on tomb furnishings. Interestingly, the model of a wooden sailing vessel from Beni Hassan, now located in the Ashmolean Museum, contains a 3-dimensional representation, here on the left, of 2 individuals playing a senet game on the deck of the boat. In the New Kingdom, senet, meaning passing, became associated with the journey to the afterlife. Scenes of senet playing were included among the vignettes of chapter 17 of the Book of the Dead, or magnified on the walls of the tomb. On the right, you can see Queen Nefertari playing senet, and when you walk out of here, you can cheer at her as you see this facsimile lining the walls. I will sometimes refer to that game as it is well represented by archaeological and textual material. But my purpose today is to talk about the game of Hounds and Jackals. Contrary to the senet game, it was popular only during one specific period in Egypt's history, the Middle Kingdom, at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. The game of Hounds and Jackals has not yet been identified in ancient texts, so we do not have its original name. It is perceived as a race game based on luck, namely the role of the equivalent of dice, in which pin-like playing pieces are stuck in holes, forming a track. It has no visual representation apart from a fragmentary one at the top of the slide, which you can see on this papyrus kept in the Turin Egyptian Museum. On this slide, you can see on the left why Howard Carter called the game Hounds contra Jackals. This unique ivory set was excavated by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon in Thebes in 1910. It is one of the masterpieces of the Metropolitan Middle Kingdom collection, on view in Gallery 111. This is the only example to have returned the original pegs, 5 pins carved in the form of a hound head, and 5 pins with a jackal head. The Theban, other modern designations of that game derive from the description of the board. The Theban example is also called the palm tree game because it bears an image of a palm tree in the center, for which you can see a drawing here. Sir Flinders Petrie is the first to use the term 58-hole game board. It refers to the 29 holes pierced on either side, forming 2 parallel tracks. The field is completed by a centrally placed 30th hole. This leads to another appellation, the game of 30 points. Finally, the game was referred to as the shield game, owing to the similarity of lead Bronze Age boards to a defensive weapon. On the right is an ivory board from Megiddo in southern Levant. This example gives us an idea of what the drawing on the papyrus should have looked like. The game of senet enjoyed a long life, but was geographically restricted to Egypt and its neighboring regions, the Levant and Cyprus. Whereas the game of Hounds and Jackals has a much shorter life in Egypt, but crossed more borders. The small size of the boards, not exceeding 20 centimeters, allowed one to travel with it easily. It was found in the north as far as Anatolia and throughout Western Asia, including the Iranian plateau. There are over 60 known examples of this game. As you can see on this map, it continued to be played in the Near East until the mid-1st millennium BC. Black dots correspond to the 2nd millennium BC, and white ones to the 1st. Under the country's name, the number of examples with unknown provenance that have been attributed to that region is indicated. During this talk, I will first explain the generally accepted route of play deduced from the layout of the playing surface and present the three different types of layouts. I will then talk about a recent discovery in the Metropolitan collection and show how Egyptian games have helped shed light on gaming accessories from the Near East. Finally, I will address the possible significance and symbolism of this game for Rebirth in the afterworld. Although the ancient rules were not retrieved, several attempts have been made by archaeologists and experts of the history of games to reconstruct them. For those of you interested in these reconstructions, I've written the recent references on the slide. In general, we assume the outcome of the game can vary. It may be agreed between both players before a series of games begin. In 1912, Howard Carter made the first serious attempt to understand the game. Here is Carter's reconstruction of the numbering sequence of the holes. The name Game of 58 Holes has been contested because some boards bear 61 holes. The additional holes are considered by some as starting holes. They are indicated on the screen on a wooden example from Deir el-Bahari. One side is attributed to each player. The most largely admitted route of play is down the center of the board, of either 10 or 11 holes, round to the outer edge of 19 holes and up to the larger holes. No casting implement was found directly associated with any board, so we are not sure how the players were induced to move their pegs along the board. We think that players used throwing sticks or astragals to determine it, and that each player had 5 pegs according to the number of pegs found with the Theban board. Casting sticks functions as the principal randomizing agent from the dynastic period through the New Kingdom. Irving Finkel just explained that they were thrown like Mikado. They took the form of semi-cylindrical slips of wood, bone, or ivory. In cross-section, one side was rounded, the other flat. This form descended from length of split reed or palm branch. The ends were often finished in the form of fingertips or the head of a canine, the sticks. The players count the number of flat sides facing up. The other potential method was the use of astragals, or knuckle bones, adopted by the Egyptians in the game of Senet from the 17th dynasty on. They were possibly employed earlier. 3 astragals are associated with the Metropolitan game of Hounds and Jackals in some publications, but they are not likely to belong to the board. They are actually not listed in the itemized equipments of the game in the excavation report. Astragals were also manufactured in wood, clay, ivory, or stone. In its manipulation, each astragal can land with one of 4 distinctive sides facing up. But let's go back to the board. The progress of the race was affected by the presence of interhole links and emphasized holes. Holes 6 and 20, as well as 8 and 10, are linked by lines. The lines could function pretty much like our beloved game of snakes and ladders, or chute and ladders, which means you can fall behind just when you thought you were about to win. From hole 10 onwards, every 5th hole is marked. Holes 15 and 25 have a design reminiscent of the hieroglyph Nefer, which means good. It is assumed that the positions provided with the Nefer sign brought promotion to players that landed on them, like an extra throw. The Nefer hieroglyph is also present. It is repeated 3 times here. On square 26 of Senet, the square is called the Beautiful House or House of Happiness, and it's a beneficial square where players must stop before continuing their journey. At the end of both tracks is a much larger hall, which is sometimes surrounded by the hieroglyph Shen that may have meant end of the track and is commonly interpreted as meaning eternity. This ultimate destination counts as space number 30. The first player to move all the pieces into the Shen halls wins the game. The game may have originated in Egypt, where the oldest board games were found in the capital of Thebes and in provincial sites. They are dated from the first intermediate period and the early Middle Kingdom. The segment board on the left, found by Petrie and Brunton in 1921 in a disturbed shaft tomb, was assigned to the 9th to the 11th dynasty. Its redating to the early Middle Kingdom has been proposed. The small board on animal legs in the center was found in a tomb at Deir el-Bahari. It was discovered in the 1920s by the Metropolitan Egyptian expedition. Winlock suggested that it may be the oldest one, as it is dated to the 11th dynasty. The palm tree board is made of sycamore wood, overlaid with ivory and ebony. It is also supported on animal legs in the form of the fore and the hind legs of bull. Like for the other examples on this slide, a drawer was made to hold the playing pieces. It was found in a tomb dated to the 12th dynasty, as it also contained a toilet box with the name of Amenemhat IV. The shape of these early Egyptian boards is compared to an axe blade or a shield. These early Egyptian examples belong to the style A group, following Irving Finkel classifications based on the layout of the playing surface. The boards on the left are made of wood and the Lahoun board of baked clay. When Petrie found the board in Lahoun in 1889, he wrote, quote, "No such game is known in Egypt as yet." In fact, this unique piece was already in the Louvre collection since 1827, but it was not identified as a game until Petrie and Brunton published it in a volume of Sedgman Report a century later. It had been catalogued in the inventory as a frog-shaped writing case, the larger holes being interpreted for ink cups. It was part of the vast collection of the British consul Henry Salt, bought by Jean-François Champollion for the Louvre, but no further information about its provenance is known. This game board stands out from the others as much for its shape, that of a hippopotamus, not a frog, as for its material, a blue faience with delicate inlays. The turquoise faience, fine and matte, and the colorful glass decoration indicate a date around the 5th or 4th century BC, a time when Egypt was under Persian rule. This would explain why such an exquisite piece had been manufactured for the elite close to the Persian satrap, who was still playing this type of game, whereas the Egyptians had abandoned it centuries ago. The practice of connecting certain holes by means of lines, which characterizes style A, does not seem to have met much favor after the Middle Kingdom. Other methods were introduced to provide linkage. Special holes of style B bond can be larger and emphasized by inlays, like on the Susa fragment here in the center. Rosace motifs were also widely used. Rosace on Near Eastern board games are the equivalent of the Nefer hieroglyph, which brought promotion to the player. Number 13 on the slide is a wooden plank presumably found in Egypt. It was brought to the Cairo Museum by Grebeau from his trip to Upper Egypt in 1888. It is dated to the New Kingdom due to its similarity to the shield or violin-shaped examples from Megiddo in the southern Levant. During the New Kingdom, Egypt Empire embraced Nubia and parts of the southern Levant. These regions share the same type of games. The Megiddo bones are the most famous, but other shield bones were found in the southern Levant at Gerar and Bet Shan. They are dated from the 15th to the 12th century BC. It has been suggested that this, here, the pierced circle at the top, represents the goal. It is often referred to as the labyrinth. The 8 holes would receive the winning pieces at the end of the game. The fragmented drawing seen at the beginning on the Turin papyrus depicts this type of board. Then, during the Iron Age, at the turn of the 2nd to the 1st millennium BC, Iranian boards show contrasting interhole links that cross from side to side. This element changes the nature of the game, which becomes more complex and involves interactions between the players. These boards, now in the British Museum and the Louvre, were assigned to a third category, style C. On the right side is the terracotta board found in the Necropolis B at Tepesialk. We have seen earlier that the equipment consisted of a set of casting implements, astragal or throwing sticks, and 2 sets of opposing pegs, differentiated by their size, material, and/or decoration. The Theban pegs are the only ones found associated with the original board. They inspired this great reconstruction for the movie The 10 Commandments in the 1950s. The gaming pieces were distinguished in the movie by their color. The pegs with bent or pricked ears are described as hounds and jackals. The identification of the jackal has been contested. Sets are sometimes referred as dogs and foxes, or as 2 different kinds of dogs, favorite companions of man. During the Middle Kingdom, dogs are portrayed frequently and with a great variety. In Beni Hassan, a hunting hound with upright pointed ears and a similar hound with lop ears are depicted in the paintings. Hayes considers 2 different kinds of dogs for our pegs, a hound and, quote, another large canine animal frequently seen as the sacred animal of the god Anubis. We will see later that Anubis' connection to a game device is relevant, and of course, the choice of a fast runner animal is adapted to a race game, but I don't know much about dog races in ancient Egypt. In a text about an Egyptian game, the player says, "My fingers are like the jackals who draw the bark of the sun." In the Mehen game, the game of the snake, seen earlier with Irving Finkel, one reaching the center of the snake-shaped board would symbolically join Ra on his bark. Here is a drawing depicting the sun's god journey through the night. This commentary about the jackals can refer to the use of the casting sticks, decorated at their hands as previously shown by a finger and a canine head. These could also refer to the jackal-headed pieces of our game, like the 5 fingers of one hand. Pieces ending with a dog are known in several museums. On the screen, you can see examples from unknown provenance, now located in the Louvre, the Metropolitan, and the Turin collections. The presence of these pegs in the North Cemetery at Licht points to the practice of the game there. They probably accompanied wooden playing boards that have not been found yet or were destroyed by dampness or termites. Taprod pegs with notched heads, possibly imitating the pointed ears of the jackals, here in the center of the slide, were used in Megiddo. Some pins, catalogued as hairpins, may in fact be game pegs, like the pin with a monkey figurine here on the right, found along fragmentary bones at Susa in Iran. Ivory and metal pins with animals at the top were found at Kültepe Kanesh in central Anatolia, and it has been suggested that they were used to play. Pins, shorter and thicker than hairpins, may have been used as gaming rods. The name Game of 58 Holes is preferred when talking about Near Eastern evidence because no Hounds and Jackal specs were used in the Near East, but new interpretations of Mesopotamian text may change this view. The Sumerian word gish elag is found in sporting and games context. Gish is the Sumerian determinative for wooden objects, and gish elag is translated throw stick. Vermaak, in a recent article, connects this word, gish elag, with a game board. He points out a Sumerian proverb connected to the fox or jackal. Here is the proverb. A fox or jackal walked around a throw stick. Vermaak reads instead, a fox or jackal walked around the game board. In other proverbs, the dogs and foxes are outlined as opposites, and the fox outwits the dog. For example, what will the dog do to what the fox has made? We must be careful as we are not sure about this new translation, but these Sumerian proverbs fit well in the context of our game. Most of the proverbs date from the first half of the 2nd millennium BC, a time when the game of Hounds and Jackals precisely travels in the Near East. The military, diplomatic, and commercial relations that animated Egypt and its neighbors facilitated the spread of board games. In the Middle Kingdom, Lower Nubia was conquered by the Egyptians, who built a chain of fortresses along the Nile to guard their frontiers. Under Senusret I, a huge fortress was built at Buraine and restored by Senusret III. Buraine was not only a military stronghold, but a trading and dispatch post of economic importance. It's situated here, north of the Second Cataract. Egyptian soldiers lived and played here. Clay fragments of gaming boards are attested from Buraine, unfortunately not from stratigraphically sealed context. They were found in the debris of the east inner ramparts and at the south inner ditch between Towers 1 and 2. The fragment on the left is close to the rough clay version from Lahoun, so it certainly dates to the Middle Kingdom, whereas these two fragments on the right, which may belong to the same board, probably date to the New Kingdom as they recall the Cairo example. They were found in the debris of the inner town. Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom pottery and objects were found in the debris from the town site, so it is difficult to ascertain a date other than stylistically. No pieces to play with these boards were found. Games of 58 holes have been circulating in the Near East during the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. They are attested since the period called the Old Assyrian Merchant Colonies in central Anatolia in the 19th and 18th centuries BC. Middle Kingdom imports and examples of Egyptian influence are known from central Anatolia. This gaming board in Egyptian blue is one of them. It was found in the Sarikaya Palace of Achem Uyuk. It is the upper surface of half a Style B gaming board. A complete one from a merchant house at Kültepe-Kanesh is shown here to give an idea of its potential shape. It would have had a maximum length of 12 centimeters. The holes are of 3 different sizes. 2 large ones, the starting hole and the goal, 3 medium-sized ones, number 6, 20, and 25, and the small ones. Its largest holes are lined with gold. It was recently on view at the Metropolitan Museum during the Beyond Babylon show. An ivory game, also with gold inlays, was found in the same room, but it lost its original shape as a result of the conflagration of the palace. Achem Uyuk, here on the map, is a large mound located south of Ankara on the Konya plain. It lay on a route linking Anatolia and the east and seems to have been an important center for the copper trade and industry. The excavation in central Anatolia brought to light 2 other examples of 58 holes board games. Another complete board from Kültepe-Kanesh, here, and 1 fragment at Karaoyuk. 2 fragments were recently identified among the ivories from the Pratt collection in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art, thanks to the marking of special holes, an arrangement so consistent from board to board that we could recognize a 58-hole gaming board. They have been installed in the Anatolian Gallery earlier this week, so you can have a look at them. The first fragment represents the upper right side of a board. A starting hole and holes 1 to 4 and 22 to 29 are preserved either in full or in part. The starting hole and hole 25 were inlaid. Black material kept in the starting hole was examined, and its appearance suggests that it may be faience. The second fragment most probably belongs to the same board. Here is a drawing in order to visualize how to place the fragments. Their reverse has been worked to be adapted on a surface, most certainly on wood. As we have seen earlier, game boxes were carved in blocks of wood, sometimes decorated with ivory panels. Playing accessories are much better preserved in Egypt than in the Near East, because wooden objects are preserved there due to the dryness of the climate. So far, no other playing accessory has been found among the Pratt collection. Nevertheless, we know that Egyptian game boards had animal legs, as you can see again with the game from Thebes, the game from Tutankhamun tomb, and a painting from Beni Hassan. John Arous suggested that the 4-seated sphinxes, certainly the most striking figures of the Pratt group, and the lion legs, a standard Egyptian form, could have supported a stand for some kind of board game. It has been stated that Anatolian learned this game from the Assyrian merchants, responsible for the introduction of writing and cylinder seals in Anatolia. I think we should question the common tendency to emphasize the impact of the Mesopotamian culture on its neighbors. The growth of the Anatolian corpus and its Egyptian character raises the question of how the game was passed on from one region to the next. The Mesopotamians may not be responsible of its diffusion. Central Anatolia was part of a vast trading network that took place in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd millennium BC. A trade route connected Cappadocia and Egypt, overland and by sea. The Middle Bronze Age is a time during which not only at Byblos, but also further north at Syrian Ebla, we find an imposing Egyptian artistic presence, but no evidence of our game is attested there to date. Games of 58 holes may have been circulating in the rest of the Near East during that period, but early examples from Mesopotamia and Iran are difficult to date. Further discoveries may help us to better understand how these games spread in the Near East. Boards have been found in elaborate and humble versions, in materials ranging from gold-inlaid ivory to wood and clay, suggesting that the game was played by members of all classes. Secular recreational games were also part of Egyptian rituals, illustrating the ties between the sacred and the profane. Like the Senet, the game of Hounds and Jackals may have been associated with the journey to the afterlife. Throughout their history, the Egyptians often included different game boards among the burial goods. Moreover, miniature games were deposited in the tomb as simulacra for the next world. On the right is a model of gaming board, a rectangular alabaster plaque with engraved grid on both sides. It was found in the burial of a man in Arage Cemetery A. Winlock suggested that the Darrell Barry board had been used as it was repaired along one side, but it could well be a model considering its miniature size. On the left, the wooden turtle from a tomb at Draabu el Naga is dated between the 11th and 17th dynasty. It was found in the same tomb as 6 pins with canine heads. Benedict raised his doubts about its use as a pin cushion and announced that it will be included in his catalogue of games from the Cairo Museum, which unfortunately remains unpublished. Like the Darrell Barry board, its size may point to a simulacra function, especially as the holes and tracks are not in compliance with a regular board. The back of a turtle has already been used for a votive game during the pre-dynastic period. It's shown here in the center, and it's in the first gallery in the Metropolitan. According to Fisher, it is probable that the frequent representation of the turtle in the Middle Kingdom was intended to be apotropaic. Game-shaped amulets protected ancient people. Small medallions imitating the game of 58 holes were found in Iran in the cemeteries of Tepe-Sialk and Dinka-Tepe. Here is the drawing of the bone pendant from Dinka-Tepe, now located in Tehran Museum. When describing the shape of the board, I have mentioned comparisons to a shield. Moreover, connections between boards and human representations are still made today. The board on the top left, from unknown provenance, surely supported this idea with its pair of eyes. The Gezer board, initially identified as an Ashtoreth plaque, comforted the anthropomorphic and religious implications for the board from Egypt and the southern Levant. An anthropomorphic vocabulary is also used to describe the boards from Susa, with the head for the top here, and the feet for the bottom part. The anthropoid shape led to the idea of resurrection. Sophie Erdos suggested that the holes on the body-shaped board had to be streamed through to allow the deceased to born again. In his study of social symbolism in ancient and tribal art, Carl Schuster includes the game of Hounds and Jackals in his Rebirth gaming board category. I would like to thank Sarah Graff for having pointed this publication to me. Schuster makes the comparison between our game and the Indian game called Ladder of Deliverance, to become the game of snakes and ladders. Quote, each compartment symbolizes the hazards of fate. Ladders connect good rebirth. Snakes connect bad rebirth. Dice determine each move. This game is generally played on the body of a human figure or god. Points on the body attained by players determine their fate. Passing through the deity's head symbolizes release from further incarnation. The Egyptian god Anubis was responsible for the mummification and protection of the dead for their journey into the afterlife, so his connection to a funerary device, like a rebirth board game, is relevant. Anubis pegs would perform the necessary ritual on the board, which symbolizes the deceased body. Schuster also interprets the boards like a genealogical chart. Such a chart is a path to be followed into the afterworld. He sees the body of a human turtle for the shield boards, and he compares them to a drawing made by the Malaculans of Vanuatu. Quote, the Malaculan artist first punched a framework of dots in the sand, then drew an unbroken, never-ending line around these dots to form a figure identified as simultaneously human ancestor and cosmic turtle. The dots, or rosettes, would correspond to joint mark. 12 being a complete set: shoulders, elbows, wrists, hips, knees, and ankles. In many ancient and tribal societies, the human body served as a genealogical chart. Joint marks represented the souls of primary ancestors. To achieve reunion with one's ancestry and thereby qualify for rebirth, a continuous line connecting each joint might be drawn to form an image of the first one, or traced in the air with the person touching the joints of his own body. Or a sequence could be followed on a gaming board with peg holes equivalent to the guide dots of sand drawings. The immediate goal was to remember the first one. Finally, the path is completed by a centrally placed 30th hole, which leads to the appellation the game of 30 points. This number being of great importance for the ancient Egyptians, with the 30 days of the lunar month and the council of the 30. The hieroglyph Shen at the end of the track is commonly interpreted to mean eternity. The first player to move all the pieces into the Shen hole wins the game, or more poetically, to quote Graham Davis, sees them go forward into eternity. Well, why did the game cease in Egypt at the end of the Middle Kingdom? We could ask Irving if it was a bad game. Pastime in the daily life have changed, and it's reflected in the burial customs. During the New Kingdom, we observed the increasing importance of the Senate, especially in funerary context. Senate, a 30 squares path, have supplanted the so-called game of 30 points. The game of 20 squares, introduced in Egypt under the Hyksos rule, is systematically adapted to the reverse of the Senate box, here with the Taya game box. And the evolution of the Senate can be seen on the Sen here at the top here, where the deceased Imam Nes is playing alone. The game of Hounds and Jackals enjoyed a much longer life in the Near East and did not totally disappear from Egypt. The wooden plank from the Cairo Museum and the hippo from the Louvre, presumably from Egypt, are dated after the Middle Kingdom, as well as the Turin papyrus, which depicts the board circa the 11th century BC. This papyrus is known as the Great Game Text. It is shown here, because it documents, among others, the Senate game, but also the double game of 20 squares. But this papyrus is subject to debate because it was incorrectly restored. Let's hope to discover new information about this game in other papyri and see the corpus of complete set grow. So you've been hearing about the same game for almost a quarter of an hour. Well, it is also possible to learn how to play as modern replicas are made. It would be great to find the palm tree game in the Met gift shop around Christmas time. Well, here, a palm tree game reproduction, as well as other ancient games, are currently used in an education program in Belgium. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our first two speakers. I would just like to say we're going to have a 10-minute break now, and just to stand up and stretch your legs. And please be back in 10 minutes for our third speaker, Anna Contadini. Welcome back, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our final speaker of today, Dr. Anna Contadini. Dr. Contadini is reader in the history of Islamic art at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. She's also director of the Treasures of SOAS project and member of the Center for Persian Studies at the London Middle East Institute. She has, in the past, been a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum and also the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. Her doctoral thesis examined early Arab and Persian manuscript painting, a research topic that is still central to her work, as demonstrated by her very recently published volume, A World of Beasts, a 13th century illustrated Arabic book on animals, Nat al-Hayawan, in the Ibn Bakhtishu tradition, published in 2011. Other interests include art and material culture of the Islamic Middle East, artistic contacts between the Islamic world and Europe, and aspects of contemporary Middle Eastern art. Among her publications are Fatimid art at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which she published in 1998. And in connection to the topic of today's lectures, and her lecture in particular, she's written several articles that include discussion of Middle Eastern gaming pieces, especially Islamic ivory chess pieces, draftsmen, and dice in the Ashmolean Museum, which was published in a collection of papers, Islamic Art in the Ashmolean Museum, part of the Oxford Studies series in 1995. She's also written a figurative Islamic ivory chess piece and bone, ivory, and shell, artifacts of the Byzantine and Islamic periods. At the moment, she's preparing a study on Islamic objects in the ambo of Henry II in Aachen, which include semi-precious stone chess pieces of the abstract type. Her talk today is entitled Moves in the Abstract, Chess Pieces of the Middle East. So please join me in greeting Anna Contadini.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored. I'd like to thank Sheila, obviously, and also Michelle Ridgely from the Islamic Department who have facilitated things for me, and also Jennifer Mock and Nicole Licht from the Education Department for organizing things for me so nicely and efficiently. Okay, maybe we could have the lights down. In his world history, the 10th century Arab writer al-Masudi gives us many details of the game of chess as it was played in India. He tells us of the various uses of the chessboard, how it served for studying the strategy of war and for making mathematical calculations. He remarks that the chief use of ivory in India was for the manufacture of chess and backgammon pieces, and tells how the Hindus played for high stakes, precious fabrics, and jewels. Like earlier writers, he asserts that the game was introduced into Persia from India, along with the Kalila Wadimna, a famous book of moralizing fables, during the reign of the Sasanian emperor Khusrau Anushirvan, or Khosrow I, who reigned between 531 and 579 AD. Later, in the 11th century, the great Persian poet Firdausi gives two stories about the chess in his Book of Kings, of the Shahnameh. One relates how chess was invented in India, the other derived from the Chatrang Namak, or the Book of Chess written around 750 to 850 AD, tells how chess passed from India to Persia at the time of the same emperor Anushirvan mentioned by Masudi in the mid-6th century. The Chatrang Namak, in which it is stated that the game of chess represents the battle of two armies, is an invaluable source for understanding, even if only approximately, the rules of chess at this early stage in its evolution, for it gives the names and moves of the pieces, which were different in many respects to those we know now. For example, corresponding to the queen, there was a counselor or advisor with drastically reduced powers. Indeed, it was one of the weakest pieces on the board, being able to move only one square diagonally. Instead of the bishop, we have the elephant, which was only able to move 2 squares diagonally, although it could jump over an intervening piece. Castling was unknown, and the pawns of foot soldiers had yet to enjoy the advantage of the initial double leap. The pieces that already have the moves we recognize now are the horse, which becomes the modern knight, and the rukh, or rook, its early Indian incarnation being a chariot. The story in the Shahnameh about the arrival of chess in Persia tells us that the Indian Raja sent an envoy to Khusrau Nushirvan with a chess set and a message written on silk. Now, before Irving was saying that board games are learned by watching, you watch and learn. But according to the Shahnameh, that's not the case, because the poor Buzurg Mir, who is the Persian counselor, had to understand the game and how the pieces moved without any help. And if he didn't do so, the Indian Raja would cease to pay tribute. So Buzurg Mir, probably aided by the indiscretions of the Indian envoy, solved the problem within a week. And this scene is shown in a fine miniature from a 14th century manuscript of the Shahnameh here in the Metropolitan Museum, in which Buzurg Mir explains the chess pieces and their moves to the envoy in the presence of the emperor. So that's here. The Indian envoy, typically depicted with dark skin and a different style of clothing, is sitting at the left of the chessboard. The text under the picture then goes on to describe how Buzurg Mir invented the game of nard, or backgammon, which the Persians in their turn challenged the Indians to solve, a feat they could not accomplish. And this painting shows backgammon being explained to the Raja and his court by Buzurg Mir, who is again being seated at the right of the board. While in this painting from a later Safavid Shahnameh of 1536, we have Buzurg Mir that, having dealt with chess, so they've dealt with the problem with chess, and now Buzurg Mir is preparing the board for the game of nard. In the Shahnameh, both games represented a battlefield and were very much alike, the important difference being in the arrangement of the board and in backgammon the use of dice, described as being made of ivory with spots of teak wood. Unlike Firdausi, most early writers agree that backgammon is older than chess. The earliest references to chess in Persian literature date from the Sasanian period, while from the 7th century on, we also have the beginnings of references to chess or shatranj in Arabic. One is in a letter attributed to Abdul Hamid al-Khatib, an epistolary scribe born around 686 AD, who wrote official documents for the later Umayyad caliphs. And if authentic, it would indicate that chess had reached the Arab world by then. During the early Abbasid period, from 750 AD on, references became more abundant and point to the increasing popularity of chess. According to the famous chess player and writer Al-Adli, writing around 840 in Baghdad, there were famous masters who were known by name, Different grades of expertise were recognized, and there are extant chess treatises from the period with specimen problems, all very modern sounding. Involvement with chess did not, however, meet with universal approval. Indeed, Islamic religious authorities objected to it. Along with backgammon, it was classed with games of chance. And both games were played for stakes, and certain variations of chess were played with dice. These were probably of the rectangular shape, with just 4 numbers on the opposite faces, 1, 6, and 2, 5. These examples were found at Fustat near Cairo, and this is another beautiful example from the British Museum. And you can see that this particular side has the number 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then these are the little circle with dots are decorative. But the cube shape was also known, and as dice were used for a wide variety of games of chance, it is very difficult to differentiate those that use cube dice from those that use rectangular dice. An example of the now familiar cube shape is provided by a group excavated in Nishapur, dating from the 9th century and now here in the Met. And one, datable to the 10th century, excavated at Mansoura or Brahmanabad, part of the Arab Empire in Sindh. And this was found together with a rectangular die, now fragmentary, and 2 draftsmen. For those dice that do not have an archaeological context, any attempt at dating by comparison may be unreliable, as the shape and decoration of dice and draftsmen remains unchanged for centuries. But let us return to chess pieces. On the chessboard of the 14th century manuscripts we saw earlier, the sets are depicted in typical fashion, black opposed to red. The pieces are not very precisely drawn, but one can just about make out the shape of a couple of them, and they appear to be in the abstract form. For example, the rook here, this is possibly a king or queen, maybe this is a horse or knight. But when Buzurg Mir, back in the 6th century, was solving the riddle of this unknown game, what type of pieces was he playing with? Well, the early history of the shapes of chess pieces is shrouded in mystery, just as is the origin of chess itself. There are no surviving chess pieces from India from the time before the game reached Persia, and only a few specimens from Persian domains from the 7th century down to the 10th. For this period, therefore, our knowledge is unfortunately very limited. But let's see what we can make out from the available archaeological and textual evidence. During the early Islamic era, chess pieces fall into 2 broad families as far as shape is concerned. In one, the pieces are more or less naturalistic representations of figures, while in the other, they have abstract forms. Let's start with a few examples of the first category, beginning indeed with a potentially pre-Islamic example. Although we cannot be certain, this Sasanian stone elephant, 6th or 7th century, here in the Met, could have been a chess piece, equivalent then to the bishop. More securely identifiable as chess pieces are a few early representational ones. They include, among the most important archaeological finds of the early Islamic period, the figural chess set from Afrasiyab, old Samarkand, today in Uzbekistan. Excavated by Buryakov in the 1970s and now at the State Museum of Samarkand, it is datable according to archaeological context to the late 7th, early 8th century AD. To the Afrasiyab pieces, it is possible to relate an ivory chariot or rook in the British Museum reportedly also from Samarkand area and likewise datable to the 7th century. Another ivory horse with rider here at the Met obviously had something on top of the rider's head, I think a hat. Wilkinson dated to the 11th century, although in the light of the Afrasiab pieces, which were discovered long after Wilkinson's attribution, it can be now given an earlier date. Very similar to this piece is one that was sold at Christie's in London in 1994, and which can be dated to the 7th to the 9th century, again having the Afrasiab pieces in mind, and notice the hat. Then we have an ivory elephant in Florence, in Museo Nazionale del Bargello, attributed to the Iraqi region and dated to the 9th, early 10th century on the basis of stylistic comparisons of the carved decoration on its back. And then a very beautiful but very complex ivory elephant in Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale, which has been considered for many years a chess piece, although this is by no means certain. It bears an Arabic inscription on the base in angular or Kufi script, Min Amal Yusuf al-Bahili, the work of Yusuf al-Bahili. The piece has been ascribed to different dates spanning the 9th to 15th centuries, a reminder of the problems we face when a piece does not have an archaeological context. Cunell identified the artist with a 9th century Indian sculptor, but the puzzling thing is how to reconcile an Arabic name, an Arabic inscription, with a sculptural style that is instead totally Indian. The type of script dates it to the late 9th, early 10th century, and we may suppose the carver to have been an artist trained in the Indian manner and part of the workshop of Yusuf al-Bahili, a Muslim, probably in Sindh. As Barry Flood has recently shown, this complicated scenario becomes more comprehensible if we bear in mind the intercultural dynamics of 9th and 10th century Sindh, with its interweaving of Muslim and indigenous Indian elements. Let us now turn to the second category, that of abstract pieces. Possibly the earliest example are the 9th century pieces excavated by the Metz Iranian expedition in Nishapur, which are now here in the museum and were published by Wilkinson in 1943. They were found in a house, are in ivory, with virtually no decoration apart from carved vertical lines, and apparently include opposing pieces as one is colored green. The horse, though even if stylized and vastly different from the Afrasiab pieces, is still recognizable as a horse. And another horse or knight, very similar to it, but in stone, is now in Kuwait. There are also other pieces that are sort of semi-abstract. For example, this wooden king found in Afghanistan and attributable to the Ghazni period, 11th to 12th century, in which you can see the stylized shape of a throne and the stylized head of the king. Another is this ivory rook here at the Met, where it is possible to recognize a chariot formation with two horses' heads and what would have been the place for the riders, and just compare it with the chariot rook I showed you before from the British Museum. With the fully abstract horse pieces, the head is represented by just one protuberance. As you can see on the conically shaped knight from this beautiful double set in ceramics with turquoise and purple glaze, not excavated but reportedly to be from Nishapur and now here at the Met. A date to the late 11th or 12th century has been confirmed by technical analysis conducted on 2 of the pieces. Other fully abstract pieces from an archaeological context include 8 wooden ones found in the 1970s and 1980s in the shipwreck of Sir Celemani off the coast of Bodrum in southern Turkey by the underwater archaeological team of George Bass. And they were found together with a draftsman as well. The wreck is especially known for its tons of broken glass, probably originating from one of the Middle Eastern glass-producing centers and destined to be recycled in one of the more northerly European centers. Coins found in the ship securely dated to the first half of the 11th century, and the wooden chess pieces were found together with them, and they were most probably used by the crew. With such abstract pieces, identifying which is which can be a problem. Often, in treatises on the game of chess, the pieces are not represented, being identified by letters or by their full names, a practice that sometimes continues in later period, as shown in this 6th century manuscript of the Chatrang Namak, but with figures added much later. So you can see that the pieces are represented by letters and by numbers. The pieces are Shah, or king, Firzan, or queen, Fil, elephant or bishop, Faras, horse, knight, Ruch, castle, rook, and Baidak, pawn. It is in fact in the 1283 treatise on chess of the Spanish king Alfonso X the Wise, Libro del Ajedrez, Tablas y Dados, written in Spanish probably from Arabic sources, that the pieces are first found clearly drawn, with board positions enabling the correct identification to be made. And you can see them very clearly drawn here. The treatise is also interesting for it shows different types of people playing the game, including Moors, and there are other paintings that show the game be played by women, although in this painting the woman is providing a musical accompaniment to the players playing the harp. And in some other paintings, the game is played by children. The Alfonso treatise illustrates in detail every phase of the game, and also the making of both dice. You can see that there are scraps of ivory that are used in the different phases, and then this instrument to produce the dots of the dice. And also, it illustrates the making of chess pieces. This very interesting and instructive painting, in fact, it's a wonderful painting, shows both the preparation of the board on the left and the manufacture of the pieces. The carver, in this rather painful position, is working with a bow lathe. By pushing the bow back and forth with his right hand, he rotates the spindle to which the black chess piece is attached, while with his left hand he's not cutting his toenails, but he's sort of he holds an instrument terminating in a blade, supported by his toes while being guided by the left hand. Once finished, the pieces were put on a shelf. They are to be assigned to what I've termed style set B, except for the bishop and knight, which belong to style set A. But let's look further at these style sets now. So style set A. Here, the king and queen have an identical shape, usually interpreted as a stylized throne. The queen is smaller than the king. The pawn has more or less a rounded conical shape. The elephant or bishop has two protuberances, reminding us of the tusks of the elephant, and the horse or knight has one protuberance. The rook has a rectangular body, normally at least twice as wide as deep, with a deep cut in the middle top, creating two horns on the outside that can be interpreted either as the protective size of a chariot or of a crenellation of a castle. Together with the Nishapur and Serche-le-Mane set we've seen before, this stone set of the 11th century now in Kuwait may be assigned to this style set, to this group. And I also show you the individual pieces. So this is the king or the queen, the bishop with the two protuberances, the knight, the rook, and the pawn. And to give you an idea of pieces in this style in other media, here is a king or queen in marbled glass, here at the Met, from the Mamluk period, Egypt or Syria, 13th to 14th century. And here we have some of the very famous rock crystal pieces called the Agar chessmen, already part of the Agar collection in Catalonia in the 11th century, which then passed into the Behag collection in Paris, and then passed into the Asabah collection now in Kuwait. And these are the single pieces, and notice the carving, which is in relief, and which is very beautiful and very sophisticated of these rock crystal pieces. In ivory, we have the remarkable pieces in the British Museum. I only show you 4 of the various pieces there. So there are, there are 3 queen or kings and a knight. These are solid pieces of ivory with incised and inlaid decoration with a dark sort of mastic, typical of an Egyptian Fatimid production or from Fatimid-influenced Sicily of the 10th to 11th century. Pieces belonging to this set can be just seen in the painting I showed you at the beginning from the early 14th century, Shahnameh. Testimony then to the endurance of this style set. Let's now have a look at style set B. This style appears later than style set A. The two are sometimes found together, but style B becomes more frequent with time and style A less so. Here, the king and queen are cylindrical in shape, often waisted, and normally have a domed top or a knob, which unfortunately is missing in these ivory pieces from the Dalton collection of the British Museum. The pawn has the same shape, so that the 3 differ only in size. The king is the biggest, the queen is medium, and the pawn is small. And you can also see the familiar decorative motifs of the inlaid circles. The rook usually has a round base with an X-shaped top, as in these examples again in the British Museum, but there is also a very beautiful one here in the Met. It's not just the only one, but I'm just showing you an example here in this museum. Both bishop and knight have a round base and a long cylindrical neck, and it's not always easy to distinguish between them. The bishop generally has a tapering top, while the knight has a small protuberance. This is confirmed by the drawings and their relative positions in manuscripts, as in this painting from the Shahnameh of 1520 to 40, where again the story of Buzurg Mir and the Indian envoy is represented. And you can see here very clearly the rook and possibly a knight or a bishop and pawns. We have now reached the stage where we can begin to attempt a chronology of the development of shapes of Middle Eastern chess pieces, even though the evidence is limited and not always easy to interpret. So style set A appears in early archaeological contexts from the 9th century, but survives in later sets. It appears to have been the most frequently used style of Islamic medieval times, and it greatly influenced the Western medieval pieces. It originates in the Islamic Middle East, as is well represented by the pieces you have seen, and by their later 11th to 12th century Western counterparts, the Nuremberg pieces. It embodies the earliest style yet found and is one that remained popular in the Middle East from the 9th century until at least the 14th, with the majority of examples from the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Style set B appears later, and there is less archaeological evidence for it, so that in general the pieces are more difficult to date. However, there are a few from archaeological sites, Rubaira in Iran, for example, datable to the 13th century, and they are depicted in contemporary miniatures. This style continues up to the Ottoman and Safavid periods, as demonstrated by these examples from the 16th or 17th century. Although you can see that here we have rooks in both style set A, the one in the middle, and style set B. So I should stress that within this style set, as one might expect, there are variation and consistency is not always maintained. A useful check on the results of such stylistic analysis has now been provided by radiocarbon examination. This has been carried out on 5 of the ivory pieces in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which serve as an important point of reference for pieces in other collections. So let us consider first the 2 rooks which belong to style set A. The radiocarbon examination gave the result of 11th century for the one on the left and 9th century for that on the right, thus confirming the dating proposed above for the particular shape of this rook. Radiocarbon dating has also been undertaken on a number of pieces from style set B. They consist of another rook and a bishop or knight. Radiocarbon date is in accord with the range proposed before and places it between the 15th and 16th century. Similarly, with 2 other pieces, each of which is a king or queen, these are among 4 from the same set, and the examination, which is therefore valid for all of them, gave in each case an approximate date to the 15th century. Then there is the question of when, where, and why chess pieces started to become abstract. This is still a matter for debate. Scholars have tended to attribute the appearance of abstract pieces to the Islamic rejection of representation. The theory being that 1, figurative pieces were used in India, 2, with the advent of Islam they became abstract, and 3, they then became figurative again in Europe. But a simple linear development of this kind is not demonstrable, and the retention of figurative pieces alongside abstract ones undermines the case for a religious motivation. In any case, as is well known, secular Islamic art was widely representational, not just at the beginning when post-classical models were adopted, but also during the following centuries. It might be thought, rather, that the trend to abstraction was encouraged by the difficulty of carving complicated shapes in, say, rock crystal, as against ivory, which is a more malleable material. But we know that rock crystal could be carved to a very high standard, especially with the famous ewers of the Fatimid period, and the Aguerre chess pieces we saw before have a very sophisticated and beautiful carved decoration on them. Rather, we may think more generally of social and economic factors. It is interesting, for example, that the earliest abstract pieces do not come from princely archaeological contexts, but have been recovered in dwellings of ordinary people, house in Nishapur or Sir-Suleiman ship. But in the Middle East and later in Europe, chess becomes, both in the Middle East and later in Europe, chess becomes a game for everybody to be played at home or in the cafes, an expanding market for which the simpler and cheaper abstract designs were well suited. However, there is no simple correlation. Complex figurative pieces would be more expensive to produce, but it doesn't follow that the wealthy insisted on them. The Spanish treatise for the King Alfonso X is illustrated with abstract pieces, while on the other hand, the abstract rock crystal pieces we saw were hardly made for the everyday household. Thus, however important social and economic factors may have been, they do not of themselves provide a sufficient answer for the adoption and distribution of the abstract pieces. Another conundrum concerns the transmission of chess to Europe. There is an extraordinary ivory set now at the Bibliothèque Nationale Cabinet de Médailles, once in the treasury of Saint-Denis, that was believed to have been sent to Charlemagne by the famous Caliph of Baghdad, Harun al-Rashid, protagonist of many of the 1001 Nights stories, on the occasion of Charlemagne's coronation in the year 800. Unfortunately, the set dates from the end of the 11th century and is probably of southern Italian manufacture from Salerno near Naples. The legend of the gift is, nevertheless, eloquent testimony to relationships between East and West that go back to the Middle Ages and reflects the common practice of sending luxury items as diplomatic gifts. Indeed, whether or not chess was known at the court of Charlemagne, evidence for its presence in Europe long before the time of Alfonso X is provided by the Venafro pieces, for which a late 10th to early 11th century date has now been confirmed by the radiocarbon tests conducted at two different laboratories, one in Naples and one in Sydney, yielding the same result. They are therefore to be considered as a result of the influence in other cultural spheres of the move to abstract forms that originated in the Middle East. However, figural chess pieces emerge alongside them, dramatically exemplified by the famous Louis chessmen, presently on a wonderful exhibition at the cloisters. Carved not from elephant but from walrus ivory, probably in Norway in the 12th century, these were found in the Outer Hebrides. You can see here the island of Louis. Here, apart from the geometric abstraction of the pawns, all the pieces are complex carvings of human figures, knights on horseback, bishops with mitre and crozier, and berserk, shield-biting warrior rooks. And here you have a king, and this is a bishop. But one may also note a later and quite independent trend back towards abstraction in Europe. Apart from the highly durable horse, in many modern sets, realism is replaced by symbolism. We may note finally that chess pieces of the typical abstract Middle Eastern form are not necessarily always used as chess, for chess. A particularly striking example is to be found on the ambo, or pulpit, presented to the palace chapel at Aachen by the Ottonian Emperor Henry II between 1002 and 1014, when he became the Holy Roman Emperor. This extraordinary assemblage of objects includes 6th century carved ivories at either side, so there are 3 and 3, 6, huge. A central, large, green glass Roman vessel cut in relief, Roman agate vessels, 2 rock crystal vessels carved in relief, possibly of Mesopotamian 10th century date. And around all these objects are placed colored stones and chalcedony and agate chess pieces of the abstract Islamic Middle Eastern type. So you can see here, for example, 2 horses or knights, and here 2 rooks. This is a bit damaged, and then the pawns in between. Here again you have a horse, and you can see in the pawn, you can see how they are sort of fixed, placed on the plaque. You can also see the museum number having been incised here. And here again you find knights and pawns and possibly rooks. And here you find the bishop with the 2 protuberances. And here again you can see how they are disposed in those squares with the object in the center, and then the chest. This is missing. It has been suggested that the whole assemblage needs to be seen in the context of the use of spolia from ancient Rome and contemporary Byzantium. The term spolia referring to objects that, having been taken from a context, are reassembled into another, often with quite different functions. According to this reading, their symbolic value was twofold, allowing Henry II to associate his rule on one hand with a powerful Roman past, and on the other with the sophistication of other Middle Eastern contemporary cultures. A conscious association with the Islamic world, however, is by no means certain. The pieces probably came via Byzantium as part of the treasure of the Byzantine princess Theophanu, wife of Otto II, uncle of Henry, and she brought it with her and would most likely have been considered Byzantine. Nor is it clear what symbolic value the chess pieces might have had. That they have been organized so as to represent armies on a field seems most unlikely to me. Rather, together with the other stones on the ambo, they should be considered primarily as part of an aesthetic program, assembling pieces that were not manipulated but were included exactly as they were because of their color and beauty. The use of color stones is significant, as it is also possible that the characteristically medieval concept of varietas, or variety, played a part, since there is evidence that this was extended to the sphere of material culture, thus aligning the ambo aesthetically with the deliberately contrastive assemblages of differently colored gems and rock crystal found on contemporary Krukes Gemmatae, such as the Lothar cross, also in Aachen, to be dated to circa 1000. The chess pieces on the ambo are thus ultimately ambiguous. Their non-figurative style points to a possible origin in the Islamic Middle East, but as has been mentioned, they may well have been understood as Byzantine, and there may indeed be early examples of Byzantine pieces in Islamic style. They thus add one more twist to a complex history of diffusion that has taken us from India to Persia, to the Arab world, and then on to Byzantium and Western Europe. It is one that has generated its own legends surrounding transmission and has provided for us this legacy of beautiful and sometimes enigmatic pieces as witness both to fine craftsmanship and to the enduring fascination of the game itself. Thank you.